Is considered a top emerging market. For more on the global landscape for countries in this particular category, I sat down with Gavin Serkin. He's the author of Frontier, Exploring the Top 10 Emerging Markets of Tomorrow. He explained how to invest in countries where, well, markets may not even exist yet.
I think that what you're seeing now is an opportunity to get back into the markets, but on a very limited, diversified manner. You know, it's not about picking the asset class of emerging markets or frontier markets. It's about really doing your homework and deciding, you know, which country is going to be the best positioned for the world that we're in, because, you know, you've got all sorts of headwinds, like, you know, what Janet Yellen's going to do next. You've got the Greece crisis. You've got different things that do affect emerging markets as a whole. You've got the price of oil. So it's important to get those country picks right.
All these markets, as you just insinuated, they're all tied together in one way, shape, or form. Does the rule of diversification mean as much as it used to?
It does in frontier markets. You see, that's the difference. If you don't have very much diversification within developed countries because they are all interlinked. If you pick a country that's a frontier market, a true frontier market, like, say, Myanmar, it's all about what's going to happen later this year with the election. You know, will the Aung San Suu Kyi party, the NLD, be victorious? Will it have a convincing election enough to bring that country out to reintroduce ties with the international community, enough to get the economy going? That has nothing to do with what the Fed's going to do. It has very little to do with what oil is going to do. So that's where you can get diversification. So, you know, in a way, you think of frontier markets as being very risky, but if you take them on an individual basis, you can actually spread your risk.
Let's say I like a particular country, Vietnam, Myanmar. Well, you can't exactly just go to the New York Stock Exchange and say, I want to buy into that. It's much more complicated than that. So how does one, after you've picked the country, begin to figure out how to put your money there and invest there?
Okay, so take Myanmar, for example. It doesn't even have a stock exchange yet, so you can't go to Myanmar and put your money in, as you say. There are some proxy listings that you can get. For example, Yomar is a company that has a big Myanmar experience in terms of real estate and tourism. It's listed in Singapore, so there's some access that you can get. Vietnam has kind of restrictions on some of the stock listings that we're seeing being reduced now, but still it's quite limited for an investor. You can go to an ETF, you can go to the New York Stock Exchange and buy bulk access to a country like Vietnam, but it's not really very satisfying in terms of, you know, really picking out what you want to be.
Because you're not doing all the homework.
Because the investors in this book, you know, their main thrust of investment is the consumer. You know, what you're doing in frontier markets is you're usually getting to an economy where you're just starting to get that disposable income going, where you've come from a situation where incomes are very low, subsistence kind of living, to where they can spend a bit of money, and you're starting to see retail industry rising up.
So you talk about the top 10 emerging markets of tomorrow. So given our time constraints here, give me the top 2 that you think are going to be at the forefront of this discussion 5-10 years from now.
Okay, so the origins of this book were the investors picking the 10, and then I got the investors to also then narrow it down. Number 1 pick was Nigeria. Now, Nigeria has all sorts of challenges against it: corruption, violence, the oil situation, but you have an economy that is starting to build up. You've got a population that, if you believe UN statistics, by 2050 will overtake America. So the population of the world will go India, China, Nigeria. This is a sort of a BRICS type story. Number 2 is Vietnam. And there you have kind of a similar dynamic to Nigeria in a way. It's a very entrepreneurial society. A well-educated society, and you're getting companies that are starting to compete. For example, Vina Milk, you know, the dairy producer in Vietnam, exports to 20 different countries around the world.
Surprise countries on the list, and I'll broaden that a bit more to any surprises that you found, you know, in writing the book.
Okay, probably the most surprising country there, when you think about frontier markets, Saudi Arabia. one of the wealthiest countries in the world is a frontier market, and it's because investors outside of Saudi Arabia couldn't get access until last month. A month on, we've had the Saudi Stock Exchange opening, and you're starting to see that foreign money go into Saudi on a limited basis. Also a surprising place to be because it's just so different from the culture that we're used to in the rest of Asia, in Europe, in America. You've got to take on board the sort of society that you're going into, and that's true with a lot of these countries.